never imagined a single envelope could change my entire life. It was so ordinary looking, plain white paper, my name written in my father's unmistakably neat handwriting. No frills, no decoration. Just my name. But the weight of it in my hands, it felt heavier than anything I had ever carried before. If you are watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I still remember the exact moment I received it. My parents had invited me over for what they called a family dinner, though something about it already felt strange. My mother had been quiet on the phone, her usual sharpness softened by something that sounded almost like guilt. My father didn't speak at all, just cleared his throat in the background and told me I should come. The dinner itself was awkward. The table, usually so full of chatter and my mother's nagging about my eating habits, was silent. I tried to fill the silence with small talk, my job, the noisy neighbors in my apartment building, the silly mistake I made when I burned toast that morning. But neither of them laughed. When the plates were cleared, my father slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me. "This is for you," he said. His voice was firm, but his eyes were avoiding mine. I picked it up, confused. "What is this?" "You'll understand when you read it," my mother said softly, and for the first time in my life, I saw her hand tremble as she reached for her glass of water. At that moment, I didn't open it. I just held it, my stomach twisting into knots. There was something about the way they looked at me, like they were both ashamed, but also relieved, that told me this wasn't just a letter. This was a confession. I need to pause here to explain something about my parents. To outsiders, they looked perfect. My father was the kind of man who never let his tie hang crooked, who spoke with authority that made people listen. My mother was meticulous, organized to the point of obsession. Our house always smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh laundry. Neighbors used to say we were the model family. But inside those walls, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. My parents were strict, sometimes cruel in ways that left scars I still carried. I grew up learning that love was conditional if I performed well, if I obeyed, if I didn't talk back. Any failure was met with silence or sharp words that cut deeper than any slap could. Yet, despite it all, I loved them. I wanted their approval more than anything. I worked hard in school, went to a good college, got a respectable job. Everything I did was, in some twisted way, for them. So when that envelope landed in my hands, I knew it wasn't going to be praise. It wasn't going to be a letter saying how proud they were. No, this felt like something else entirely. I drove home that night with the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside me. I kept glancing at it, as if it might open itself. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, my heart pounding in ways I couldn't explain. Every mile closer to my apartment, I fought with myself. Should I open it now? Should I wait? What could it contain that made my parents act so strangely? By the time I walked into my apartment, I was shaking. I put the envelope on the coffee table and just stared at it. Hours passed. The clock ticked, the city lights outside flickered, and still, I sat there, frozen. When I finally tore it open, my life shattered into pieces. But I'll get to that in a moment. First, you need to understand how much trust one had placed in my parents, how much I had sacrificed just to live up to their expectations. Because only then will you truly understand why their betrayal cut so deep. Growing up, my parents never encouraged dreams. When I was little, I loved to draw. I would sit by the window for hours sketching trees, flowers, even the faces of strangers who walked by. My notebooks were filled with doodles, tiny bursts of creativity I couldn't contain. One day, I proudly showed a drawing to my mother. It was a portrait of her, the best I could do at 10 years old. She glanced at it briefly, then set it down on the table without a word. "Go to your homework," she said. That was the day I stopped drawing. I buried every piece of myself that didn't fit their mold. My parents wanted results, achievements, something they could brag about. And so I gave them that, even if it meant losing myself in the process. So when I say that envelope destroyed me, you have to know, it wasn't just the words inside. It was the confirmation that everything I had sacrificed, everything I had endured for their sake, was built on a lie. I'll never forget the way the paper felt between my fingers. Thin, fragile. My father's handwriting filled the page, precise and neat, the way he always wrote. It started simply enough. My child, it read. Not my name, just my child. I frowned, reading on. There are things we should have told you long ago. Things we kept from you, believing it was for your own good. But now the time has come. You deserve the truth. I read those lines over and over. My throat tightened. My vision blurred. Truth? What truth? And then, sentence by sentence, the life I thought I knew unraveled before me. My hands trembled as I held the letter closer to the lamp. Each line pulled me deeper into a darkness I never imagined existed within my own family. The letter continued. We are not the people you think we are, and you are not who you think you are. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I whispered the words aloud, as if hearing them would make them make sense. Not who I think I am. The letter went on. You were never meant to grow up with us. The truth is, you are not our biological child. We adopted you when you were only a baby. We told ourselves it didn't matter, that we would love you as our own. But over the years, keeping this secret became a burden we could no longer carry. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes. Adopted? The words screamed at me from the page. My chest tightened, my entire body shaking. I had always felt like an outsider in my own home. The way my parents treated me, strict, cold, unyielding, suddenly made sense in the cruelest way possible. I wasn't their real child. Maybe I never was. I picked it up with trembling hands. The handwriting was messy, hurried, almost desperate. At the top, in bold, were the words, "To my daughter." My daughter. The letter was from him. My real father. If you're reading this, it means you're old enough now to know the truth. I never wanted to leave you. They told me I wasn't fit to raise you, that you would have a better life elsewhere. But not a day goes by that I don't think about you. You are my everything, even if I cannot hold you. Please don't forget me. Please know you were always loved. But the letter wasn't finished. Your biological parents were complicated people. They could not raise you. We stepped in to give you a better life. We know this revelation may hurt you, but it is the truth. Enclosed are documents and one final note. Your real father tried to contact you years ago. We stopped him. We thought it was for the best. My heart nearly stopped. They had kept me from my real father? Someone out there, someone who wanted me, had been cut off from me my entire life? I slammed the letter down onto the table, my tears blinding me. My whole body felt like it was on fire. Questions pounded in my skull. Who am I? Why would they lie? Why now? The room spun as I stumbled to the envelope again. Inside, beneath the folded letter, were a handful of documents. My birth certificate, except it didn't have my parents' names on it. Legal adoption papers, signed, sealed, finalized when I was just a few months old. And at the very bottom, an old, yellowed letter. I pressed the letter to my chest and sobbed. He had loved me. He had wanted me. And my parents, the people I had called mom and dad my whole life, had kept him from me. For hours, I sat on the floor, surrounded by papers that didn't feel real. My life, rewritten in a few pieces of paper. When the tears finally slowed, rage began to take their place. How dare they? How dare my parents play God with my life? They had decided I didn't need to know the truth. They had stolen my right to choose. They had robbed me of a father's love. The walls of my apartment felt suffocating. I needed answers. I needed to hear their explanation. So, I picked up the phone and dialed their number. It rang once. Twice. Then my mother answered, her voice groggy like she had been waiting for this call. You read it, she whispered. My voice shook with fury. How could you? How could you keep this from me? My whole life, my entire existence, you lied. There was silence. Then my father's voice came on the line, stern, cold, as if he had rehearsed it all. We did what we thought was best. That man, your so-called father, was unstable. He was reckless. You wouldn't have had the life we gave you if we hadn't stepped in. My blood boiled. A life? You call this a life? Do you know what it's like to grow up never feeling loved enough? Do you know what it's like to feel like a stranger in your own family? Maybe that's because I wasn't your family after all. My mother's muffled sobs echoed in the background. My father stayed silent, his pride unwilling to bend even in the face of my broken heart. That was the moment I realized they weren't sorry. They never would be. And if they thought I would simply accept this truth and move on, they didn't know me at all. Because I was going to find my real father, and I was going to uncover every single secret they had buried. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw two faces, my parents, sitting across that dinner table with their guarded expressions, and the shadowy image of the man who had written my daughter at the top of that fragile letter. By morning, I was exhausted, my eyes swollen from crying, but my mind was sharp with determination. If my parents wouldn't tell me the full truth, I would uncover it myself. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, analyzing every detail. The adoption papers had signatures from lawyers I didn't recognize, a court date from decades ago, and, most importantly, the name of my biological father, Daniel Carter. Daniel. The name felt strange, foreign, but also mine. The letter hadn't included an address, just his name and a city, 3 hours away from where I live now. My parents must have assumed I'd never look, but they underestimated me. I typed his name into search engines, combed through public records, even checked old phone directories. Dozens of dead ends, people with the same name, but none of them matched the timeline. Finally, I found something. A faded news clipping from nearly 20 years ago. Local mechanic fights custody battle for infant daughter. My breath hitched. It had to be him. The article mentioned a custody case dismissed due to unstable living conditions. The words made my stomach churn. Was this what my parents had meant when they called him unfit? But if he was so unstable, why had he written me such a heartfelt letter? Why did his words feel more genuine than anything my parents had ever said? I had to know the truth. After asking around at a local diner, I finally found someone who remembered him. I drove for hours, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The city where the article said he lived was unfamiliar, industrial, with rows of aging houses and corner shops that looked forgotten by time. "Daniel Carter?" the waitress asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yeah, he used to come here all the time. Quiet guy, kind eyes. Haven't seen him in years, though. Heard he moved out to the edge of town, near the old train tracks." With her directions, I found myself standing in front of a rundown little house, its paint peeling, its yard overgrown. My heart pounded in my chest. Was this it? Was he inside? I raised my hand to knock on the door, but froze. What if he didn't want to see me? What if he had moved on, forgotten me? Or worse, what if my parents had been right about him all along? But then I thought of his letter. "You were always loved." Those words gave me the strength to knock. The door creaked open, and an older man stood there. His hair was graying, his face lined with years of hardship, but his eyes were the same as mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then his lips trembled, and he whispered, "It's you." The floodgates opened. We sat inside his modest home, surrounded by worn furniture and photographs of a life lived in quiet solitude. He brought out a box. Old pictures, letters never sent, tiny trinkets he had kept over the years. "I fought for you," he said, his voice breaking. "I fought so hard, but they took you away. Said I wasn't fit. Said you'd be better off. And then they disappeared. I tried to find you, but every door slammed in my face. And now," his eyes glistened as he looked at me, "now you're here. I cried as I held one of the old baby pictures he handed me. My chubby cheeks, my little fists curled up. Proof that he had loved me, proof that I wasn't unwanted. But along with relief came anger. Anger at the people who had stolen these years from us. My parents. When I returned home, the fury inside me boiled over. I confronted them again, this time with evidence. I met him. I spat, slamming the baby picture onto their polished dining table. He loved me. He never abandoned me. You did. My mother's face turned pale. My father's jaw clenched. You don't understand, he snapped. He was dangerous. He couldn't provide stability. We saved you. Saved me? I laughed bitterly through tears. You didn't save me.
You stole me. You stole him from me.
You stole me for myself. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. Not the fear of losing control, but the fear of being exposed. And that's when I realized the adoption wasn't as clean as they wanted me to believe. There was more. So much more. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Every word my father had spoken replayed in my head, his insistence that he had saved me, his conviction that Daniel was dangerous. But I had looked into Daniel's eyes. I had seen his home, his collection of photographs, his trembling hands as he passed me the letter he had written decades ago. That wasn't the face of a dangerous man. That was the face of someone broken, someone robbed. So why had my parents lied so ruthlessly? I went back to the documents spread across my table, searching for something I had missed. My fingers brushed over the adoption papers. On the surface, they looked official, court stamps, signatures, notarization. But something about them nagged at me. The dates didn't align perfectly with the court case I had found in the news clipping. The custody battle was dated 3 weeks after the adoption had supposedly been finalized. That didn't make sense. How could they finalize an adoption before the court had dismissed his custody rights? A chill ran down my spine. These papers weren't just suspicious. They were forged. I dug deeper. Public records, legal databases, anything I could access. And the deeper I went, the more cracks appeared. The lawyer who had supposedly represented my father during the custody battle? No record of him ever existing. The judge's signature on the adoption papers? Sloppy, inconsistent with other verified signatures. My hands shook as I pieced it together. My parents hadn't legally adopted me. They had stolen me. The truth hit like a freight train. My entire life, my identity, was built on a crime. And the people who raised me, the ones I had sacrificed everything to please, were criminals hiding behind a mask of perfection. I confronted them again, this time armed with the evidence. I laid the forged documents on the table, my voice shaking with fury. These papers don't match. You forged them. You stole me. You lied about everything. My mother's face went white, her lips parting in shock. My father's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing like a cornered animal. You don't understand what you're saying, he hissed. I understand perfectly, I snapped. You destroyed my life and his. You kept me from my real father. And for what? To play hero? To feed your pride? For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then my father slammed his fist on the table so hard the documents fluttered. We gave you everything, he shouted. A roof, an education, a future. Do you think you'd have had that with him? He was nothing. A mechanic. A drunk. A failure. We saved you from his pathetic life. My mother flinched at his words. I saw something flicker across her face. Regret, guilt, maybe even fear. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "We shouldn't have done it." My father glared at her, but it was too late. The truth was out. That was the moment something inside me shifted. The grief, the confusion, the heartbreak, they all hardened into something sharper. Something stronger. If my parents thought they could bury the truth forever, they were wrong. They had built their perfect reputation, their flawless image in a community, on a foundation of lies. And now, I would be the one to shatter it. I looked at my father one last time, my voice cold and steady. You may have stolen my past, but I won't let you steal my future. I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. His face drained of color. For the first time, I saw fear in him, not of losing me, but of losing the image he had built, the mask he wore for the world. And that fear gave me power. That night, I packed up the documents and Daniel's letters. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about reclaiming my identity anymore. This was about justice, about making them pay. Because if they thought the truth would stay hidden inside a sealed envelope, they were about to learn how wrong they were. When the sun rose the morning after I decided to fight, it felt like the world had turned slightly on its axis. Everything looked the same. The same chipped curb outside my building, the same neighbor watering her plants, but inside me, nothing would ever be the same again. I had evidence. Daniel's letters, the forgery I discovered, the birth and adoption papers that didn't add up. But evidence alone would not break the fortress my parents had built. They had reputation, money, friends in high places, a lattice of small favors and smiles that protected them from scrutiny. I knew I had to be strategic. I wasn't just confronting family, I was confronting an institution. First, I made copies of everything and stored backups in places they could never find. My email, a cloud drive under a false name, and with an old friend who kept legal records for a nonprofit. I wasn't naive about how quickly something could disappear if they suspected it existed. If they tried to burn those papers, they would already be everywhere. Then I started where my parents were most vulnerable, their image. They were pillars in the community, chairman of the neighborhood association, regular donors at the church, people who hosted eloquent dinner parties and smiled politely while others admired them. They valued public admiration. It was the currency that had kept their conscience in check. If that currency came crashing down, everything else could follow. I began by contacting the local journalist who wrote the human interest column in the evening paper. I didn't go in with emotion. I went in with facts. I showed him copies of the adoption papers, the news clipping about the custody case, and Daniel's letter. His eyebrows rose when he saw the forged judge's signature. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is big. Bigger than I expected." He asked for more documentation and for time to verify everything.
Time. Time was my advantage now.
They would not be able to spin the narrative fast enough once it began to unravel. While the journalist checked leads, I took another path, the legal route. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer who handled family law pro bono for people with small claims of wrongdoing. I walked into her office with stained clothes and swollen eyes, but with my papers folded neatly in a folder. She listened without interrupting, then she said something I will never forget. They can be held criminally liable for forging documents. They could face charges for fraud, and there are civil remedies for you as well. Hearing those words was a strange, fierce relief. Rage was a fuel, but logic and process were the engine. We filed an initial complaint and requested an investigation. The lawyer helped draft letters demanding production of original documents from my parents, original medical records, original court filings, bank statements showing payments to legal services that couldn't be verified. The pressure started small and discreet, legal letters that asked polite questions. My father's first reaction was to laugh it off. "It's just paperwork," he told my mother. "We'll get through it." But then the journalist published his story. The headline splashed across the local paper. "A Family Secret, Claims of Stolen Childhood Stir Community." The article was careful at first. It presented facts and questions, not conclusions. It quoted Daniel's old letter, quoted the adoption documents, and asked why records didn't match. It didn't accuse. It only asked the questions everyone else had been too polite to ask. Silence was my parents' early tactic. They clung to the old ways of ignoring anything that might stain their reputation. At first, their friends called, offering support and suggesting private family counseling, the kind of sympathetic platitudes that meant business as usual. But then the comment section lit up with people sharing their own whispers. a neighbor who remembered seeing my mother sign papers when I was a baby, a cousin who mentioned a hurried conversation in a church hallway years ago where my father told someone to mind their own business. Rumors became corroboration. The story spread like a crack in ice, widening. The neighborhood association called a meeting to discuss community concerns, though everyone knew why they'd gather. My parents arrived in their Sunday best, smiling like statues. My father took the podium and recited their rehearsed lines. "We have always acted in our child's best interest. There are complexities you cannot imagine. We ask for privacy." But a seed had been planted. At that meeting, a woman I'd barely spoken to before, the old lady across the street whose house my mother had once helped paint, stood up and said, "I saw those papers. There was never a legal hearing. I've always wondered." And then another voice. "My cousin used to work at the registry. There were discrepancies." The room shifted. Those little admissions were the pricks that let the air out of my parents' proud balloon. The next weeks were a blur of meetings and interviews. The headlines splashed across the local paper. "A family secret. Claims of stolen childhood stir community." The article was careful at first. It presented facts and questions, not conclusions. It quoted Daniel's old letter, quoted the adoption documents, and asked why records didn't match. It didn't accuse. It only asked the questions everyone else had been too polite to ask. Silence was my parents' early tactic. They clung to the old ways of ignoring anything that might stain their reputation. At first, their friends called, offering support and suggesting private family counseling, the kind of sympathetic platitudes that meant business as usual. But then the comments section lit up with people sharing their own whispers. A neighbor who remembered seeing my mother sign papers when I was a baby, a cousin who mentioned a hurried conversation in a church hallway years ago where my father told someone to mind their own business. Rumors became corroboration. The story spread like a crack in ice, widening. The neighborhood association called a meeting to discuss community concerns, though everyone knew why they'd gather. My parents arrived in their Sunday best, smiling like statues. My father took the podium and recited their rehearsed lines. "We have always acted in our child's best interest. There are complexities you cannot imagine. We ask for privacy." But a seed had been planted. At that meeting, a woman I'd barely spoken to before, the old lady across the street whose house my mother had once helped paint, stood up and said, "I saw those papers. There was never a legal hearing. I've always wondered." And then another voice. "My cousin used to work at the registry. There were discrepancies." The room shifted. Those little admissions were the pricks that let the air out of my parents' proud balloon. The next weeks were a blur of meetings and interviews. As the legal pressure mounted, my parents' calm facade began to crack. My father started traveling more to business meetings. He spent hours in his study, his jaw clenched, the house humming with the quiet sound of someone trying to maintain control. My mother retreated into a shell of polite explanations and tired denials. But the most devastating thing for them was not the scandal. It was the faces they saw at their door. People they had helped, neighbors, church members, old colleagues, who were now asking hard questions and not accepting the rehearsed answers. The people who had once admired their wealth and composure now looked at them with confusion and then, in many cases, contempt. As the investigation progressed, we unearthed the mechanics of the theft. The forged papers had been prepared by a notary who was later found to have been collaborating with multiple families in altering records for bribes. A small circle of local officials had allowed the creation of fictitious affidavits for a price. My parents had not acted alone. They were beneficiaries of a corrupt system. But that did not absolve them. They had chosen to profit from this corruption at the cost of a child's life. In court, the first hearing was procedural, but the moment was raw. I stood in the gallery and watched my parents sit in the defendant's seats with faces that had always seemed unassailable, now slack and tired. The prosecutor read our evidence. The judge peered at documents we had both pored over for days. My father's lawyer, a man I had once heard praise him at charity dinners, now argued the kind of legal defenses money can buy, It was in the best interest of the child. No direct malicious intent. We acted under the advice of counsel. All of it hollow sounds when placed beside Daniel's letters and the photograph of me as an infant. Outside the courthouse, the press trailed like vultures. The camera lights flashed, and I felt a surreal disconnect, like I was watching my life through a film. Strangers called me brave in the streets and handed me tissues like I was an actress. I accepted none of those platitudes. This was not bravery. This was necessity. Every move they made to defend themselves pushed more people away. Sponsors withdrew from the community gala, where my father was supposed to be honored. The church released a statement promising transparency. The neighborhood association voted to suspend him from all leadership roles pending the investigation. The cushioned life they had curated gradually deflated. But perhaps the hardest blow was something neither of us anticipated. My brother. He had always taken my parents' side in public, the dutiful son. Yet when the first legal notices arrived, he called me privately, voice shaking. He told me stories I had never heard, nights when he had overheard my parents whispering about making arrangements, vague references to money changing hands, and how he had been too scared to question them. I could hear the guilt in his words. That guilt later turned into testimony against them, a son refusing to lie for the sake of a lie. That betrayal of loyalty by my own brother hollowed them further. Their family collapsed inward, a house of cards scattered by confessions and evidence. Meanwhile, I tried to keep my bearings. There were days when the headlines made me dizzy. There were nights when I replayed Daniel's crumpled letter and wondered what years we had lost. But the small victories mattered. The journalist's follow-up that revealed the notary's record of similar forgeries, the official audit of the land records that exposed inconsistencies, and the neighbor who dug out an old photograph that showed my family's car at the hospital the day I was born, but with different names scribbled in the registry. Public exposure was not enough. I also wanted something private. The truth spoken plainly. I wanted my parents to acknowledge, in their own words, what they had done and why. So, at a council-backed mediation session with the neighborhood present, I asked them directly, "Why did you do it?" My father's face reddened. My mother's hands trembled. Under the glare of the room and the weight of evidence, their scripted lines fell away. They tried to say they had protected me, that Daniel had been a danger, that they had been saving me from a life of hardship. When I finally spoke, I did not scream. I did not plead. I looked at them and said, simply, "You stole my life. You stole his father from me." Protection doesn't look like theft. Protection doesn't look like lies told for decades. You took a choice from me. The words landed like stones. My father's jaw twitched. He opened his mouth, perhaps to justify, to rationalize, but then closed it. My mother began to cry, not the performative tears they once used to smooth over every fracture, but raw, helpless sobs that didn't wash things clean. The mediation didn't end in the catharsis I had imagined. They offered apologies that rang hollow in my ears and promises to make amends that included money, proposed reunions with Daniel, and supervised visitation. None of it would replace 20-odd years of absence. None of it would conjure afternoons missed or the name my father had never called me by. Still, the public consequences kept coming. My parents were charged. The notary was indicted. The records were being corrected. The neighborhood whispers changed tone from curiosity to condemnation. Their house, once the stage for parties and brunches, felt quieter. Guest rooms closed, portraits turned inward, the polite hospitality replaced by a brittle stillness. And me? I stood at the center of this storm and felt something complicated. There was vindication, yes, but it was laced with grief. I had wanted them to understand the harm they'd done, to see the human cost of their choices. What I had instead was a legal record and a community's judgment. The victory tasted of iron. But the battle had not yet delivered the most important prize, the relationship I had yearned for with my real father. He was afraid at first, afraid of reopening wounds, afraid that the media storm that now surrounded me would blow back into his small life. He worried about the safety of his small worn house and the people who knew him. Yet when I showed up on his doorstep after the first court hearing, he held me like a man who had been waiting decades for a future he had believed was impossible. We began to stitch together a life in small, careful ways. Sundays with Daniel felt like stolen, sacred moments. He taught me to fix a broken chair, to change a tire, to listen without judgment. He told me stories of the time he had tried to pet me as a baby, how he had been told to go away, how he had been barred from the hospital. Every story tightened the knot inside me, pain threaded with a fierce, aching love. The legal fight dragged on. My parents fought, of course. They hired lawyers who painted pictures of nuance and regret, pleading for leniency. They offered restitution. They asked for privacy and forgiveness. The courtroom, however, was unblinking. Evidence spoke in a language of dates and signatures that didn't match. The people who had once helped my parents now had to answer for their complicity. It was not a clean defeat, not a cinematic fall from grace. It was a slow, bureaucratic dismantling of a life built on lies. In the quiet hours after the courtroom hustle, when the cameras had gone home and the house seemed to breathe again, I sat with Daniel and let the small, plain routines of life patch me at the edges. We cooked together, sat on porches, shared cups of coffee and stories. I allowed myself to laugh at small things. The guard around my heart, which had been hammered down into iron, softened in places. And yet there were times when rage returned like a bitter tide. The thought of the years stolen, the first school play I had performed without my father in the audience, the graduations he hadn't seen, brought fresh, sharp pain. I knew the healing would not be linear, but deep in the chaos there emerged a clarity. I had reclaimed my story. The envelope had detonated the lie, and while the blast had ruined what once was, it had also cleared space for a life of my own making. My parents had chosen their image over their child. In doing so, they had exposed their true character. I would not let their betrayal define me. There would be more hearings, more statements, and, eventually, a final judgment that would strip them of some privileges and, more importantly, illuminate the truth to my community. The cost to them was steep: legal penalties, public disgrace, and the slow loss of a family that had once been the center of their social world. For me, the cost was the years I could never get back. But within that void, I began to build something new, an honest life, tenderly reclaimed. The courtroom was packed on the day of the final hearing. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens scratching, cameras waiting for one last flash of scandal. The air smelled of polished wood and nerves. I sat with Daniel at my side, his hand resting carefully over mine, steadying me like an anchor. My parents sat across the aisle, proud spines slouched now, their eyes darting anywhere but toward me. The judge's voice cut through the stillness. He read the charges clearly, deliberately. Forgery of court documents. Fraudulent custody. Obstruction of paternal rights. Each word felt like the peeling away of another layer of their carefully curated mask. I stared at the floor, afraid if I looked at them I would crumble, afraid if I looked at the crowd I'd be swallowed by their stares. The verdict came: guilty. Not on every charge, some loopholes, some technicalities, but enough. Enough to stain them forever. They were sentenced to fines so heavy their finances would bleed, community service under public scrutiny, and most painfully for them, the judge's public condemnation. You robbed a child of truth. You betrayed the trust placed in you as parents. The harm cannot be undone, but justice demands acknowledgement. My father clenched his jaw so hard I thought his teeth might break. My mother's sobs echoed in the courtroom, but even then, her tears felt less like remorse and more like self-pity. When the gavel struck, a strange silence settled over me. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways: rage, triumph, even collapse. But what I felt was something simpler: release. A door had finally shut on the prison of lies they had built around me. The fallout was immediate. Their friends abandoned them one by one. The community groups stripped their names from plaques and websites. Invitations stopped arriving. The people who once praised their elegance now whispered about their disgrace. Our family home, the place that had once hosted dinners and laughter, was put up for sale to pay legal fees. I heard neighbors describe it as a haunted house with curtains drawn. And me? I began the slow work of piecing together a life they had stolen. Daniel and I met every week, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to sit in silence. He told me about his youth, the music he loved, the hobbies he abandoned when I was taken from him, the regret he carried like a stone in his chest. I showed him my world, my job, my writing, the little fragments of a life built without him but waiting, always waiting, for him to fit into. We fought, too. He wrestled with his anger at my parents, sometimes spilling it onto me in moments of bitterness. I wrestled with my guilt for not knowing him sooner, even though it had never been my fault. But those fights were real, honest, and they brought us closer. For the first time, I wasn't living behind a curtain of secrets. At night, when the quiet pressed too hard, I would unfold Daniel's old letter, the one that had started it all. I no longer read it through tears. Now, I read it with a kind of reverence, a reminder of the love that had been denied but never extinguished. My parents tried to reach me. They sent letters from their new, smaller home. The words were apologies, but the kind that twisted themselves into excuses. We thought we were protecting you. We didn't want you to suffer. Can't you see we only loved you? I never replied. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Maybe one day I will forgive them in the quiet of my heart, but I will not let them rewrite what they did. The journalist followed up with one last story, not about scandal, but about resilience. He titled it, Reclaiming Her Name. For once, the spotlight didn't feel invasive. It felt like acknowledgement. In the weeks after, people approached me not with pity, but with quiet respect. A neighbor slipped me a note that read, "You are stronger than you know. Don't stop now." And I won't, because the envelope that destroyed me also rebuilt me. It shattered the illusion I was raised in and gave me the truth I deserved. My parents lost their empire of lies, but I gained something greater, a father who had waited a lifetime and a self that finally belonged to me. For the first time in years, I can breathe. For the first time in years, the story is mine.